started and have our usual increasing audience as the time goes by. So,
Okay, great.
all right.
Well, welcome everybody. This is going to be another interesting show. It's the first show of the year, and that's a significant thing. And we'll see what kind of exciting adventures we have this year. Today we have an unusual guest, I would say, because of what we're going to talk about today. I mean, we can say other reasons he's unusual, but we're going to be talking today about music and its effect on culture and how it's intertwined with culture. And we have with us Dr. Peter Hazing, and he's going to be giving us some insight into a lot about how culture interacts with music and how music interacts with culture. And we'll start off by getting some information about Peter so that you guys can have a sense of like who he is and his background and why what he has to say about this is especially important, and from where he says it. You know, some people, they they can say something because they saw a YouTube video last night. That's me, you know, but other people actually have life experiences and go deeper under the hood about a subject. And so that's why we're particularly fortunate to have Peter with us today. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks so much, Lawrence, and thanks for inviting me to do this. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you here this morning.
Okay, great. Now, let's start off, Peter, by talking a little bit about who you are. Where were you born? Where'd you grow up? We'll start there.
Yeah, so I'm a Midwest kid. I grew up in Southwest Iowa in a little town called Harlan, and it's about an hour away from Omaha. It's a town about the size of the town where I work now in Madison, and with a similar proximity to a little bit bigger place like Sioux Falls. And you know, Harlan is to Omaha as Madison maybe is to Sioux Falls, and you know, grew up in a big musical family. I'm the fourth of 5 children, and we all played instruments. We all sang together. We sang at home. We sang at church. We did all the things that lots and lots of Midwestern families do. And then I was away for a long time. After my wife and I graduated from Luther College, we both went to the Southeast. We went to Florida State University for graduate work, and I was in the Southeast for the better part of 15 years. And at that time I was going back and forth to Uganda, where I was doing my doctoral field research in ethnomusicology. So I've only recently come back to the Midwest. And when we came back, I followed my wife's work. She is a nonprofit administrator and had a brilliant career that, you know, she reinvented a number of times while she was following my various travels and graduate pursuits when we lived in the Southeast. And so, you know, we got to a point where she had a great opportunity in Sioux Falls, and Sioux Falls was a super cool place that had changed a lot since we left the Midwest. And so we were excited to get back closer to family, and here we are. It was a year later. I worked for a while at Grinnell College as a replacement for somebody who was on research leave that first year. But then a year later, I started working here at Dakota State University, where I direct the sponsored programs office, and I teach one class for the College of Arts and Sciences in music appreciation.
Is that what, did you stop or?
I did.
It sounded like you were going to. It sounded like you were go.
Well, I mean, I don't know how much you want to do on that. I've got other things I do. I've continued to publish research related to my doctoral work and some things that I've done since then, and I've also started to co-teach a medical humanities course in the ethics and humanities section of the Sanford School of Medicine at USD. Because my field research dealt with traditional healers and how they use music in their therapeutic and diagnostic practices.
Okay. Well, I was struck when we, talked earlier about your ideas about how music interacts with culture, and I think that's where we'll start, and there will be other things we may cover as well. But culture is, I always think of it, it's like it becomes part of us, and it kind of becomes important about in defining ourselves, our identities. We often define ourselves in relationship to other people. And also it's important to note that actually there's not much we can do just by ourselves. So we interact with people and they become us and we become them. Can you talk a little bit about how music plays into that?
Yeah, of the things we know about music as an art form, and to some extent as a literary form too. We know that it's closely tied to who we are and our cultural identity. And more broadly than that, who we are as human beings. We know that every single culture in human history has had some kind of organized sound practice that they engaged in. And that makes the study of ethnomusicology a really sort of a pursuit with a long backward looking view in terms of the history of music and among human species, right? But also a kind of infinite variety, the type that anthropologists concern themselves with, right? So anthropologists are concerned with kind of the space between an individual and the society at large, or the culture, if you like. And ethnomusicologists within that are particularly concerned with musical behaviors because they are so closely tied to our cultural identity, to our religious practices and our belief systems, to the ways that we transmit information, right? We use songs in school. We use songs to help govern our movement, whether that movement is dance or sport or whatever. And ultimately, those repertories that we use for all those different things are persistent. I think one of the reasons they're tied so closely to our cultural identity is because they help us remember who we are. I have an old friend who used to tell me that our friends are the people who sing our song back to us when we've forgotten part of the tune or we've forgotten some of the words.
I think that's a good point to understand what we're talking about when we say music. How do you define music? I'll preface that by saying one of my old friends used to say that music is noise that we enjoy.
I would embrace that as a drummer. Several people in my life would embrace that as a critique of me. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be pretty big-headed of me to pretend that I found music in my life. It's probably more realistic to say that music found and shaped and made me who I am as a person long before it was my profession. you know, as I mentioned, I grew up in a musical family. Both of my parents would have been those folks in the church pew that you heard singing out loud. My mother was fond of saying that if you don't like the voice God gave you, give it back. She believed strongly in congregational singing, and so that's ingrained pretty deeply in me. I've been deeply invested in congregational singing in church communities for a long time. What else? I mean, I can't remember a time in my life when I wasn't making music, either on my own or with my siblings or with my parents, at home, in school, in church. It's just always been there. And it was there for my aunts and uncles. I've got an aunt who's a wonderful organist. I've got an uncle who's a tremendous guitarist and a singer and a great storyteller. And my grandparents felt the same way about congregational singing. You know, their little tiny church in their Catholic community in Nebraska was less than a mile down the road. And they were there, you know, 2-3 times every week, doing the same thing my parents did in the pews, singing.
Mm. What can we say about what is known? I mean, you talked a little bit about it, but what is known about music and culture? What kind of things can we say? These are kind of universal things between various cultures and the music that they produce and enjoy.
Yeah. So one of the things I admire so much about some of the senior scholars in ethnomusicology and in my field is that they've spent their careers doing this kind of humanistic social science work, doing ethnography focused on music. And yet they have a gentle and persistent optimism about how much more there still is to learn and know about the infinite variety of human musical behaviors. So what we know, I would say, is small compared to that infinite variety, compared to how much it will change over any given period of time or space, no matter how big or small. But there are a few things we know about, well, there are more than a few, about what music means to us as human beings. We know it's important enough to us to write it down in a really wide variety of ways. We know that it is so closely connected with who we are culturally and economically and sometimes politically that we can very easily get belligerent about what matters to us in those domains, right? So for example, people who write music in one way may assume that that is the correct way to write music and that other ways of writing music are inferior.
What?
The truth is the vast majority of musicians in the world don't write it down at all. They have other ways of remembering it. You know, and then even if you look at just what's written music, then if you want to get really persnickety about it, there are as many ways to write it down and remember it and to be detailed about it as there are people who interpret those ways. And, you know, so there's one sort of towering giant in our field named Charles Seeger, who wrote about a linguocentric predicament that musicians find ourselves in, or musicologists especially. We are trying to communicate through words about another form of communication that really has sometimes to do with words, but mostly other aspects. And he also wrote that the different kinds of notation, some are prescriptive and some are merely descriptive. And in either case, neither really captures the whole experience on the page, right? Which is a great reason why in the vast majority of musical traditions in the world, people find other ways to transmit. They don't always have to write it down. And even people in the Western tradition will tell you that no matter what's on the page, it requires a great deal of interpretation. So this is it's been a motivator for me for a long time to push back against this notion. I even shudder to say it out loud in a conversation like this, that music is a universal language. It is not. It is a universally human experience that we all enjoy and that we have always enjoyed. It has linguistic aspects, but I defy anyone to come out of any single culture pretending that they completely understand the musical expressions of a totally foreign entity. They don't. If they did, all of us would be out of a job, musicologists and ethnomusicologists alike.
Yeah. Well, I would say I would say that we make the same mistake with language too. So in that way, if we say it has the same problems as language. You know, words, even in countries or areas where people speak ideally the same language, they actually mean different things, even between people, you know, one person to the next. So in that sense, it has a similarity is that, well, it means something to you. It's just symbolic, you know.
Yeah.
It's just symbolic. And I will make another comment too about people using notations. Some of the greatest musicians that we know don't read music at all and never have read music, you know, and they hear the song once and they say, oh yeah, I know that. And then they play it, you know what I mean? And they figure, why would I need to do that when that's it's let's say a weak way to transmit what the other person was trying to, you know, to say or to express in that musical piece. So it starts to feel like language in that you have to be in the moment or in that place where it was designed or created to have any chance of getting close to what was meant by that or what was felt by that.
Yeah. So it's a it's a long-standing irony of music in the Western tradition that one of our great composer figures is a person that musicians will say, well, he was amazing. He could hear something once and not only play it better on a variety of instruments, but write it down and improve it,
Mhm.
you know, or write it down verbatim, however he so chose. And yes, Mozart could do that, and he was a remarkable individual for that. But it's ironic that a tradition that prizes written music so much would sort of hold that at a level above. And then out the other side of the mouth, right? There's sort of a looking down of folks' noses at unwritten traditions. It doesn't make any sense at all. One of the things that language theorists, you talked about symbols a bit. One of the things that people like Ferdinand de Saussure and Noam Chomsky gave to the study of linguistics is that, you know, Saussure talked about the difference between langue and parole, right? Where you have a symbol that represents a thing, but that even that one relationship is fraught. So the example he used was mouton, which in French means a sheep, but it also means the meat of the sheep, right? So it's already complicated.
That's right.
And Chomsky later comes along and argues that all language is generative. So what Chomsky has in common with every anthropologist and every ethnomusicologist is that the generative nature of human creativity, of language, of music, of literature, of all of that stuff is, it means that variety is infinite and that we cannot have a bounded and concrete relationship between the representative symbol and the thing being represented, because no two people can understand the same way. And in the very same regard, there are
Got stuck. You got stuck, Pete.
Oh, now we've lost video, but so it seems like the kind of thing that's probably internet connection.
are
on
no
here.
true synonyms in any language, right? And so musical performances and musical symbols and all the ways that music works in the way that we ritualize it and think about it have that in common with language. But that is precisely the reason why it cannot be a universal language, not a reason why it is, right?
Well, we actually missed some of what you said because your video cut out.
Oh, bummer.
It was. I think you came back in when you were talking about synonyms, but we lost about, I say, 40 seconds or so.
Oh, okay. So my language, my Luganda language teacher in Kampala in Uganda would tell me that there are no. He was a linguist, right? He is a linguist. There are no true synonyms in any language, because that relationship is fraught between one symbol and the thing that it symbolizes. And yes, music has that in common with language, that the symbols and the way we ritualize them and all of that stuff are complicated in the first place and have infinite variety. But those are, in my mind at least, reasons why music is not and cannot be universally understood in the same ways, not reasons why it is a universal language.
Yeah. Interesting. When you talk about culture and music, can you give us some examples of how music supports culture and culture supports / creates music?
Yeah, I like the way you put that. They are, they constitute each other, don't they? Right? They're mutually constitutive. So that one of the examples we talked about when we met briefly is one of my favorites, and it requires a bit of contextual setup. I was doing field work in East Africa. I was interested in the ways in which healers use music in diagnostic and therapeutic practices. And so I was in the midst of a series of interviews with an experienced healer in the eastern region called Busoga. And one of his colleagues who did similar work to his passed away. And he had already been to the burial, but he'd gone back home. He had to check on his cattle. He had to do a few things. And then he was going back for a post-mortuary ritual called Okwabiolumbe, which means bursting death. And when people get together for this Okwabiolumbe, what they do, there are always songs associated with it. There are other practices too. But I came to realize that the practices and the songs and the other ritual actions that people take in order to remember that person and try to maintain a relationship with the spiritual powers that be. What I call those is repertories of well-being, right? So the musical repertories, that's one thing, and they're embedded in a broader repertory of practices around what people think it means to be well, to be, in this case, at peace with a tragedy in their community, but in other cases, to be physically whole, to be spiritually whole, to be psychologically whole. Those are all broader repertories than just music, but musical repertories are also part of those broader repertories. So the example I'm going to play comes from that. It was about a week long. I was sleeping in the banana plantation, which is where they bury the body, and so there's a neat kind of life and death symmetry to the notion that people eat bananas as their staple foods, and they eat sweet potatoes and other staple foods from the banana grove. And then that's also, there's a nearby spot where the ancestors are buried. So there's this cyclic notion that the ancestors are feeding their children, and a constant life and death cycle. And so they maintain a relationship with ancestral spirits and with other kinds of spirits. So you're going to see some of the ways that they talk about that in a song that's really a lamentation about a deceased healer. And this woman, by the way, probably delivered all of the babies of all of the people who were sitting there singing, and might have helped to deliver some of those very people who are singing. So you see children sitting on the laps, and you get a sense for that cyclicity a little bit.
Okay. Well, let's take a look at that.
Yeah. Jennifer, you've got that, I think.
Okay, I will set up to share here,
Thanks.
and we'll keep our fingers crossed. Okay. Here we go.
As Moses Chibale and the Baswezi sing, they feel the late Lukoe Katirida's absence through the silence of her voice. Along with her Nengo, her gourd rattles, hers was a voice that called many spirits to speak through her as a spirit medium. Her colleagues and family would need new mediums to put on her beads, wear her bark cloth, and learn her songs. This song warns that the failure to do these things could bewitch the entire community, cause everyone to lose their way, and risk a permanent rupture between the people and their patron spirits.
Very interesting that the chant quality, almost trance quality of that song.
So interesting that you say trance, Lawrence, because one of the things that this group of folks, both her colleagues and her kin and clan, her family, were doing in Okwabio Lumbe was to try to identify new spirit mediums to take over the late Lukoe Kotirida Bibirika's, the deceased woman's spiritual responsibilities. So a healer, because people understand problems of the body to have underlying spiritual causes, right? So they may understand the physiological aspects quite well, right? They understand that, you know, in her case, problems with pregnancy or the normal ways that things ought to work if people want to have an uneventful delivery of a child. They understand the physiological realities quite well, but they also believe that there are underlying spiritual reasons why things happen certain ways. And so when a healer and spirit medium dies, it's a moment of risk for the community, where they have to try to identify new mediums to take over those duties and try to figure out where they're going to get some of the same sort of primary healthcare services. Because look, there's there's a numbers game here, and the WHO, the World Health Organization, estimates that upwards of 80% of the developing world relies on these kinds of healers for the provision of primary healthcare services. You know, the ratio of allopathic physicians, people who work in clinics and hospitals, to the population is something like, 1 to 200 or 250,000 people. The ratio of traditional healers to their clients is more like 1 to 200. Right. So, and the notion that people have the resources to travel long distances to hospitals and clinics, it's just not practicable. And so that it is a moment of enormous spiritual and physiological and community risk when a healer passes. So they had to identify new mediums. And there were, in fact, at other moments in this Bursting Death series of rites, when they had to identify new mediums. And there's a moment of enormous, in fact, if you want to see the rest of the documentary, I'll send the Gumroad link to South Dakota Humanities Council so that they can post it. There's a moment at the end of this series of rites where they identify the first of these new mediums who are going to take over some of those duties. And the jubilation in the community is overwhelming, right? I mean, from a sensory perspective, the sound is overwhelming already. Like you heard the singer and you heard the drummers and you heard everyone shaking these things, but to give you just a notion of how overwhelming just one pair of these things is. I mean, these are 4 to 6 inches across each. They're filled with these really hard seeds, and they're gourd rattles, the nengo that he was mentioning. And you saw how many of them were there, right? So even though you're outside, it's dang loud,
Yeah. It's amazing how those sounds multiply too, even when you're not indoors, when you're outside. And it's beyond stereophonic when you have everybody around you playing in the same rhythm. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, so there's a whole stream of research on entrainment, what happens to us physiologically and psychologically when we're in a group of people who are in lockstep, either in rhythm or singing together. And like I've sung in a lot of choirs, right? I sang in a college choir that used to hold hands and memorize all the music so that connection could be felt more deeply through the whole choir. And the blend was outstanding. It was one of the most formative experiences of my musical life. But to go onto the other side of the globe and have this epiphany that same kind of lockstep can happen in a really wide variety of ways it changes you. It does something to you.
Can you talk a little bit about what is known about how the brain works with that, how that kind of thing works?
I can talk a very little bit about that. I'm not a neurologist. I work closely with a neurologist who's on the South Dakota Humanities Council board, named Dr. Jerome Freeman. In our work at the Sanford School of Medicine, we teach that medicine humanities course together, and so he could say a whole lot more about that than I can. But there is a vast literature on this in music studies, in cognition studies, folks like Oliver Sacks, and so he came at it from a cognition perspective. But there are musicologists who are interested in this stuff too. And among the things we know in the scientific community about music and the brain, one of the frequent topics of conversation is entrainment. Entrainment is one of the ways that our brains assimilate new information, and it's happening rapid fire all the time. It happens when we learn new words, when we learn, something about the relationship between, our voices and matching pitch. It happens when, our children learn piano or guitar or any other musical instrument. It happens when we're in class trying to assimilate new information. It's one of the reasons why repetition is so important, so that you can rehearse new information and assimilate it and make it your own. And then the education folks will talk about learning and transfer. You can learn how to apply that same information across other domains. So entrainment is one of the most fundamental ways that our brains assimilate that information. And in music, especially in a situation where everyone's sort of working from the same set of idiomatic variations, there's something that happens to our brains that we really don't understand very well at all when that entrainment becomes so repetitious and so deep and so deeply felt across a group of listeners. And what you said about trance here is really important, because traditions of trance exist across lots and lots of different cultures, right? You have deep listeners in churches where you talk about people catching the spirit or falling out, or just having a full body chills aesthetic experience. However you talk about this, it's not like we make the mistake of saying this is a cultural talent. This is something that people train themselves to do in particular traditions. It happens in lots of traditions, this notion of trance, but there's some kind of relationship between trance and entrainment that we don't really have a great scientific understanding of at this stage. And really only in the last, Gilbert Rouget was writing about this in the 80s, but he was really collecting literature and trying to survey what was out there, and then theorizing about it. Judith Becker was writing at University of Michigan, was writing about it in the new millennium. And I don't know, we still lack a good breadth of sort of clinical studies that might examine it from a team science perspective, with musicians and neurologists and psychologists all working on the same research teams. We could use a whole lot more research there to understand that connection. And yet we know there's some kind of connection.
Yeah.
Rouget wrote that the link between music and trance was in all likelihood not causal, meaning that music does not cause trance, but that music is a way that people socialize trance behaviors, right? It's a way that they experience trance beyond the individual as a social group.
Very interesting. Before we open it up to the rest of our guests, we were also talking about in the United States, we have this idea that there's American music, but we don't always, we're not always aware of like how that was developed and the cultures that it came from, and how it impacts us as Americans. What happens to us as a result of being, let's say, influenced by this music. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I think there is a connection between this notion of entrainment and theories that we have about how music moves over time and space. There are all kinds of theories about how particular musical traditions get culturally dispersed across time and space. And then there are sort of competing notions that of what's called multiple genesis, meaning that humans are humans and they can invent similar things in different places. And when those things come together, then interesting things happen. But then something might get attributed to one group or another when really, like a lyre is a good example. The ancient Greeks had lyres, and then way down on the other end of the Nile, the Central Africans and East Africans had lyres. Well, the Nile flows north, so there's an argument to be made that it started one place and then flowed north following the Nile. In all likelihood, a lyre is just a type of instrument that gets invented in a lot of different places, right? And yet musicians have this habit of imitation, We are mimetic beings. We imitate each other. And sometimes it becomes impossible to tell the difference between the original and a copy. And that's what mimesis really is and means. We see that a lot in the US. It is baked into our artistic output. Everything from blackface minstrelsy, right, is a form of imitation that very quickly gets confusing about who's who and who's winking at what and who and what's curiosity and what's truly offensive, and it is. That's one of the classic examples of American mimesis, and yet there are other examples that needn't be as offensive and yet are equally deeply ingrained in who we are culturally and musically in the US. So one of the things that like country music fans may or may not acknowledge, because country has a market history that is bound to racial and cultural identity, is that country music grew out of the blues as a form. So I'm going to play a pair of examples here. One comes from a classic Delta blues guitarist, Robert Johnson, right? Who is nothing if not country, right? He is a thoroughly country, rural Southern figure in American music, and came up with a classic kind of rural form that he was one of the first recorded voices in, but that was really a tradition that went far beyond him. He just became a symbol of it. And there's a whole narrative that around Robert Johnson and his experience at the Crossroads that reminds us of how closely linked music is with our belief system and with our stories, our whether they're folk stories or things that happen to us really in our lives, or some combination of the two. So there's a classic recording of Crossroad Blues that I want to play here. And I'm using a blues form in particular because I want to talk about how country music picked up that literary form and used it for its own purposes. So here's Robert Johnson's Crossroads Blues. All right, so can you still hear me? Yeah, I'm sure you can. So I just did one verse there, and I'm gonna play one verse of Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl Blues, and then we'll talk about it.
I just blowed in and I got them Dust Bowl blues. I just blowed in and I got them Dust Bowl blues. I just blowed in and I'll blow back out again.
All right, so there's likewise one verse of Dust Bowl Blues. So one of the things you notice across these two examples is that the blues form, no matter what the other sonic components are, is a basic AAB form. There's a statement, you restate that very same thing, and then there's some kind of answer or conclusion to that statement, right? So you heard Robert Johnson say, I went down to the crossroads, I got down on my knees. I went down to the crossroads, I got down on my knees. And then there's different versions of the conclusion to that, but it's almost always ends with Lord help me please, right? Music and the belief system. Woody Guthrie's case, same thing, AAB. So the blues form was foundational to country music and foundational to the rural stories that Southern folks told through their music. And, you know, Woody and other people pick it up and they make it a 16-bar blues instead of a 12-bar blues, or they double the size of the form to, you know, in order to accommodate the story. But fundamentally, it's still Black music, right? This is still a literary habit that they picked up from Delta blues. And it becomes at some stage in the development of country music impossible to separate the copy from the original, especially when you see artists like, you know, Darius Rucker, Southern guy, grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, you know, had a pop career and then realized at some point, I'm a country guy and I'm not going to apologize to anyone about it. But it took a long time in American music for Black artists to be able to do that in country.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, the interesting thing is that explanation has wide meaning in terms of all of the context that we don't talk about when we talk about American history between people that transcended all of the stereotypical relationships. So let's say people will have these ideas of, you know, conflict, but what often doesn't get told is all the relationships that happened below the surface to avoid the conflict, but they were deep relationships nevertheless. You know, people who would sort of secretly meet and play together. And that happened even throughout the jazz era where people, you know, couldn't go into the door of a hotel where they were playing and couldn't go in the restaurant. And then their other counterparts would go into the restaurant, buy the food and come back out and eat it with them. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
because
it happened in Duke Ellington's orchestra. It happened in
Yes.
Ray Charles bands. It happened with, so right now, Carl Gerke's doing a Dave Brubeck series of tributes because of a landmark in Dave Brubeck's careers. And one of the things that both people like Brubeck and Ray Charles did was at some point they said, no, you know, my bandmates are my bandmates. They are who they are. I'm not going to, you know, if you have a problem with who they are and with us playing together, hire somebody else.
Yeah. But you know, you can go through the jazz era, or one of my favorites is Mac Rebennack, known as Dr. John.
Yeah, man.
You know? And the relationships that he had, you know, with people, and how that translated into his music and who he was. Or Mose Allison, and I like the story that Mose Allison told about how, I think it was Ella Fitzgerald, and when he was early in his career, he was called in to play for her. And when he, you know, because her piano player didn't make it, you know, or there was some reason why he was sick or something. At any rate, he was called in as a fill-in, and he said he walked into her dressing room, and then she just started cracking up laughing, and she was laughing and laughing. And she was like, "What? Well, you know, what's so funny? You know, I just walked into the room." And when she stopped laughing, he asked her, "Well, what was so funny?" She said, "I thought you were Black."
Yeah, and she had a lot of stories like that. She and Marilyn Monroe were very good friends.
Yeah.
In part because Marilyn went out of her way to tell club owners, listen, you got to knock this off. You're going to hire this lady, because if you don't, you will have missed the opportunity of a lifetime to employ one of the great musicians of our generation. And they became great friends because they crossed the color line at a time when that was, you know, unfashionable.
That's right. And that's what made it fashionable, is so many people, or more fashionable, is so many people crossing that line.
Yeah. So this hits home in the Midwest for us in a really deep way, because so much of the popular music of the 1950s and the dance halls that were all over the Midwest in little towns had, white artists covering black music, or they had integrated bands playing in Midwest tours in these venues. And we see the evidence of this in the ephemera and the Iowa Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the South Dakota Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We see it, we hear it in the stories of people like my father-in-law and his father, both of whom were band leaders in territory bands. And in the ways that they talk about what's now come to be called blue-eyed soul, right? In other words, people who heard black music late at night on the radio out of powerful AM stations in places like St. Louis, and said, that is the coolest thing I've ever heard. I want to play that.
Yeah, exactly.
And they did
all the way into England.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, the Beatles don't happen without this, right?
And the Rolling Stones.
The Stones don't happen without this.
Exactly.
And there will be, and Led Zeppelin does not happen without this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so the thing that always amazes and actually enchants me about these kind of stories is the ability of humanity, or individual humans anyway, to rise above the pressures that try to keep them down in the hole. It's like those people who walk across those invisible boundaries that feel so real, and escape their cultural imprisonment and go on and enjoy something and create something different, because they're able to escape their cultural imprisonment and not just think, well, I look like this, so I have to play this kind of music. No, I'm a human. I can play whatever kind of music I want.
Yeah, you put it really well, and that's a concept that's near and dear to me, because I grew up in Iowa in an overwhelmingly homogenous white community playing jazz. And if I had not had that privilege and that access to that music, because some other white teacher thought it was the coolest thing he ever heard when he was a teenager, there's no way I would have any kind of way to relate to what you're saying. But now you say it after a lifetime of that, and I think, yeah, amen. Like, why would any of us want to be robbed of the cultural riches that grew out of the horrendous experience of the Middle Passage and of Congo Square and of Jim Crow? If we can't transcend that, we're in a bad place. And it is transcendent to hear a Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald, because those folks say, people used to give Louis a really tough time because he smiled all the time. And he found joy in a life that had so many reasons to be miserable. And he famously would say over and over again to people, look, my life is about happiness and music, and no amount of trying to iron that out of me can take that away from me. It was it's a simple thing, but it's very powerful.
Yes. Yeah, writing your own song is important.
Yeah.
It's an important thing to do.
Yeah.
Well, I want to open it up now to our other participants and co-conspirators in this process. And I like to reiterate to everyone that, this is, we want to hear your contributions and include you in this conversation, but it is by no means mandatory. So don't feel like pressured, though if you don't do it, we'll break your thumbs, but we want to open it up to people to contribute. And there are a few people that, or at least one, there was another one, Kurt, I think that, other people may not know. And maybe sometimes I see the names and the names don't reflect the faces or something, or I don't know who they are. So if those of you who are new anyway, could you introduce yourselves and anybody else who would like to introduce themselves to someone who may not have been here? And I can't tell. Some people I know, but there's at least a couple that I'm not sure who they are because their name is cryptic on the screen.
My name is Alphonse. Very interesting presentation here, Pete. Thank you very much. And especially the last exchange that you were just engaged in there. I have maybe what's an esoteric question, and it's drawing upon your knowledge of the literature, your professional literature. So I claim to be an August Wilson aficionado. I don't know if you're familiar with Wilson.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
glad to see you nod.
Yeah.
And as you know, there's a major influence for Wilson's plays with regard to the blues. Now, as far as teaching that, whenever I've tried to teach that aspect, I really find it difficult to bring it home any more than just playing the song that stimulated Wilson to get started in doing his work, et cetera, and then learning to listen to the blues to understand what Black Life was about, et cetera. But my scholarly colleagues argue that the spoken language of his plays is also blues. And I'm just wondering if you've come across any kind of literature that's actually tried to investigate just that point, the way in which the lines that the actors present are using a blues format of some sort. Any clue? Have you seen anything who's discussing such?
I'm not as close to the scholarly literature and the sort of the critical analytical literature on poetry and plays and other literary forms as I am to music, but I know that the ways that people talk about, folks in English departments or Africana studies departments or whatever, talk about folks like August Wilson, Lucille Clifton, Langston Hughes, are very much in keeping with what you're saying about those folks having also been contributors to this big umbrella concept of the blues, right? Certain poems of Hughes's, when you read them, evoke something of the blues, even if they don't follow strictly that literary AAB form. And by the way, I was not trying to say that that is the only blues form. It's
okay.
It's an originator. It's one of the early blues forms, but there are many, many ways in which people write and perform and play and speak, if you like, the blues. I find it fairly easy to go there just mentally in terms of August Wilson because of the subjects he deals with in his plays and because of the ways that he thought through who ought to be performing them and how, that he knew that the blues was and is an experience and a distinctive expression of Black Americans. That's not a leap really at all in my mind. But your question about the literature, I would love to ask some of my Africana Studies colleagues about that.
Well,
I just don't have the proximity to that scholarly literature as much as I do in music.
Okay, thank you. I thought I'd try because you mentioned the format and saying, well, I wonder. So thank you again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to brainstorm jump in here anytime, Alphonse or others, about other examples of literary figures, but certainly Angelou, Clifton, Hughes, what what are the other names I'm missing? Who wrote in ways that were either evocative of the blues or that could easily be sort of housed under that same rubric.
Yeah. When you talk about the, the form, the AAB form and other similar things, as you say, there are others. I think lots of poets use those kinds of frameworks or scaffolding to hang ideas on. I mean, you could even make that case with haiku. I mean, when you look at or tanka, as poetic forms, where they have sometimes it's repetitious, but it has that same one line hook. It sort of like falls back on itself, or one line underlying, or one line chorus back and forth. That sort of a call and response, another kind of blues thing that happens. A lot of literary forms that are participatory literary forms use a call and response, over different cultures having,
Yeah, the whole multiple genesis idea. Yes, and yet the blues certainly has its distinctive, beyond just form, distinctive tropes, distinctive ideas, distinctive cultural history. Yes. that do agglutinate, right? They hold it together like so many eggs in the cake, if you like.
That's right. Well, that's a good analogy, and I was thinking of a similar analogy. Is like, if you give me flour, yeast, water, and salt, I can make a whole bunch of different things out of that. But it's just flour, and it's just like how you put it together, and the circumstances, and you give it to somebody else, and they'll make completely something else different. And then sometimes you'll say, "Oh, that's just similar to so and so," But that gets to that, multiple genesis thing. It's like if you have certain things, they just suggest the temperature, the ingredients, how you're feeling, and that goes back to the blues thing. If you experience the thing that is the genesis of why people sing the blues, it's not far-fetched to think that you can create something that's similar from that same genesis.
Yeah, that's also, I think, a reason why there's a massive difference between a kid who grows up in Iowa and learns something about the blues and jazz, and how that'll sound when I participate in playing those musics, and how different that is in so many ways. And August Wilson knew this better than maybe anyone. It's why he insisted on Black actors, Black directors, Black-owned theaters. I mean, and that's gone to this day. There are musicians who do the same thing for similar reasons, because there's no way that my participation in those cultural tropes and traditions is ever going to come through to an audience in the same way that, say, a theater company that has devoted their entire existence to August Wilson's plays will do, or the way that like Kingfish, this young blues guitarist who's performing right now, plays the blues. I mean, that variety is important, and that difference is important.
I think you've hit upon something that's important. I think I just heard something that really would allow me to teach this differently. When you and Lawrence were talking about the ingredients of that, which is the mixture of, and also your recognition that, if you are coming from an exclusive community, and I may be overextending what you guys do in ethnomusicology, but if you come from an environment in which you're always bathed in those sounds are almost automatic for you. I mean, coming from another perspective in my professional life, it's like intonation is a really important piece of the way people learn languages. You were talking about, oh God, his name just went out of my head. Anyway, when you were talking about Long and Parole, we're talking about something very similar about the way in which intonation is critical in different languages and the essential nature of that. Well, similarly, I think it's one of the components of what Wilson is doing, but also adding that which those young people, or in this instance, with regard to Wilson, Black actors who have seen these things that are talked about in his stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and lived them. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is so spot on. It's any performance is so much more than the sum of its ingredients.
Yes.
And, so the example that came to mind as you were talking, Alphonse, is of President Obama singing Amazing Grace after the shooting of the Charleston 9. Any other president could have stood up there and sung that same song with exactly the same intonation and inflection and articulation. And there's no way that it would have had the same impact as Barack Obama standing there and doing that, because his lived experience and what he brought to that performance was so different from any other president who has ever been in that office.
Yeah, I think you've hit up on something for me. Thank you a lot for engaging me. I don't want to dominate this conversation around.
Not at all. If anything, it's made me more curious about your teaching and what you do, Alphonse. Thanks.
But that there is so much to be said about that idea, and it's so much to be said. Like, even when you're playing an instrument, let alone the human voice, which has all those other kind of nuances that it brings to the performance. When you know something and when you feel something and you're open to transmitting that thing through your language or through your song, your personal experience is not separable from that expression. It's kind of like, you can tell when a person like has a lived experience as opposed to when they're telling someone else's story. Because when you're telling someone else's story, there's something of your story that comes out, but it somehow doesn't necessarily match the same words that you're saying.
Yeah, Lawrence, this is a constant drumbeat of mine. I'm a board member for Sioux Falls Jazz and Blues Society. Mm. And I'm always trying to find ways of helping us as an organization acknowledge that wherever we are as cultural actors, shaping the social life of these traditions in our communities, most of us are telling someone else's story.
Yeah.
And that means we have to be pretty darn careful with it and acknowledge what a privilege that is. And then it has to mean something in terms of engagement and inclusion. And, there's only so much we can do in the Midwest, given our demographic profile. But even so, right, the acknowledgement is not nothing.
That's right. Well, I think there's a saying, you have to pay the dues if you want to sing the blues, and
B.B. King paying the cost to be the boss. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's one of those kind of things. Now, that said, I've known people who have come from places like the Midwest. They came down and ate the same chitlins, slept with the same girls, drank the same whiskey, and pretty soon they, you would know if you were behind the curtain, you would know who they were because they had become the thing,
That's the Ella story, right? So
the facade had
like
become
that with Mose Allison. But the thing is, still, I'm never going to be asked to pay the same kind of dues. I'm never going to be asked to pay the same kind of dues, and to forget that level of privilege, that's a mistake.
That's right. Well, I can understand that, but I also have had the experience where I've known people in my personal life
Yeah.
who the people who are around them will tell you, oh, he's a brother. You know,
Yeah.
he you know, he looked like that, but he ain't one of them. You know, he's one of us, you know. And that's, I mean, and they don't, how can you say, in a way you can say they earned that because they were there.
Mm.
You know, they earned that because they breathed the same air, they drank the same water, they did suffer, you know, and then they put what they had on the line to make life better for others, you know. And so there's a certain kind of camaraderie and there's a certain kind of brotherhood that may extend deeper than your blood brother,
Mm.
because you know what I mean. And so when that person pays those kind of dues, um, they're a member. You know, that's just that simple. You know, other people, of our participants, comments, questions, and please introduce yourself as you feel led.
You know, I can't stay out of this conversation for very long, Lawrence. I'm sorry I got here late. It was just a mistake. I'm Betty Sheldon. I live in Aberdeen, and I grew up here too in the white prairies of South Dakota, but spent 30 years out in the Pacific Northwest, during which time I met and was connected intimately with a Black musician who had traveled the world with the likes of the Count Basie Orchestra in the early 70s, late 60s, and had played prior to that with Earl Father Hines. He was a trumpet player, and he brought the good music. I knew somewhere out there in the world there was the music I really would feel connected to. And when he started keeping company with me, he came armed with the album of Oscar Peterson and Frank Sinatra. And so that got into my blood deeply. And he was a wonderful storyteller. I wasn't with him when he was traveling the world, but the time we had together, he told me a lot of stories of his experiences. And so this was really wonderful. I really have nothing scholarly to contribute, but I'm taking a lot from hearing you speak. And I'm sure I've heard you play, Pete, because I've witnessed some of the guys from the Sioux Falls Jazz and Blues here in Aberdeen, and kind of think maybe you were there. If not, I'll be looking forward.
Yeah, could be. I've played a little in Brookings and a little in Sioux Falls as a drum set player with various groups.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Betty.
Oh, I wouldn't have missed it. I couldn't believe I was late. I just wasn't paying attention.
Anyone else that would like to add something, questions, comments?
I'll just say one quick thing, and I want to make a note that I know Pete has to get going here shortly, so we'll have to wrap up maybe a little earlier than usual. But hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer from the South Dakota Humanities Council. I just wanted to very quickly share a comment that we got. We're also live streaming on Facebook, and I thought this was a lovely thought when you were talking, Pete, about the tribal songs and the connections and the healing. Crystal, who is a Dakota woman, said this. She said, "I can relate to the ancestral music you speak of. I believe these songs are prayers to help us connect to our relatives on the other side. When my granddaughter committed suicide, I went into the Inipi, which is the sweat lodge, with my family, and my nephews were singing prayer songs. He told me to cry it out. We'll sing you through it," he said. "The harder and louder I cried, the harder and louder they sang. It was the most beautiful experience of my life. Tears are a form of prayer too." So that's from Crystal on Facebook.
Thank you so much for sharing that experience with us, Crystal. Yeah, absolutely agree.
You know, we started down that road a little bit, and you can over clinicalize it for, let's say, for those of us who are not in clinicians. But I think there's something to the idea that music informs how we feel. I mean, it's kind of inescapable. Music can change your mood, and we know that almost intuitively. and we sing sometimes to heal ourselves, you know. The blues is classic for that, but it's certainly not the only one. That's one of the things that humans somehow know to do, is
Yeah.
when you have a certain kind of feeling that you want to heal, something's missing in your life, and to be able to sing that, or that vibration somehow does something, even if we as yet find it difficult to explain. It's undeniable that there are causal effects that are relatively predictable with music.
Yeah, and the difficulty is that they happen on different planes, right? You talked just now, and Crystal talked about healing on the individual level as a participant. You talked earlier about the kind of transcendent social healing that happens on a different plane. And then there's kind of the physiological component that you're touching on here a little bit about the cause and effect thing, and what that does to our synapses and neurons. I don't think we have to choose between those things necessarily. And yet, if you want to dig in, really, people do tend to sort of go down one of those pathways in order to try to understand it better, just because any one of those pathways is so complex.
And you get back to some of the same places, whichever
Sure.
pathway you go to.
Yeah, well said.
And one of the interesting things is how people use rhythm, for example, in healing, and another example is how oxytocin is known to flow when people sing together. I've been trying to get something like that going as a way of social healing.
Oh man, that's a whole nother session. I have a sister who's a doula.
Okay.
And that oxytocin thing is man. We should do a thing with a doula and a midwife and a neurologist. That would be an interesting conversation to talk about chemical and neurological changes.
Yeah, let's set that up. I think it would be wonderful, because we know those are things that we have repeatable evidence for. We can do that, and it is being done over and over again. So we can just talk about its effect without having to go too far out on a limb about why it happens. We can just say, whether we know why or not, it does happen. We're coming up to the end of our wonderful time here. And so I want to just put it out once more to anybody else who has something that they would feel they would like to contribute, or something they would like cleared up, or comment on, or something like that. I'll open it up for that before we close out here. Don't be shy.
Lawrence.
Yes.
Folks, this is Jace DeCory, and I'm really, really sorry for being late. I apologize, because I love music, and I'm always asking Humanities to do music stuff, and then I forgot to tune in today, and I apologize for that. And I thank you so much for sharing your thoughts regarding how music connects us all. Music is really a common denominator for all cultures and all people. It is one way that we can become close to one another, and we can become, I guess, more understanding and civil to one another, because music is a real common denominator. And I really love it what Crystal talked about healing. Healing's been something that and music is something that I use in my healing, my individual healing as a person, but also to help others. We pray, and we pray with our grandchildren, and sing lullabies to them, and doctor them, and they respond to that. They get really happy when you sing to them and when you pray with them in that way. And so it's really a wonderful mechanism. It's a wonderful way to interact with one another. And thank you for letting me say a few things. I'm sorry again for being late, and keep the good work up, folks, and keep singing, keep smiling, keep listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jace, for that. And with that comment, wonderful comment, we're going to close off. Pete has another engagement. Somebody else is on his dance card. So we're going to close off. Thank you, Pete. I'll stay on for a few minutes more in case others have something to say. But thank you, Pete, for being with us. And I look forward to you and I getting together and doing some further study on this subject.
Sure. Thank you so much, Florence, Jennifer, and everyone at the Humanities Council and everyone who's joined us today. It's been really enriching. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else have any other comments? Paul?
Just want to say I really enjoyed it. So let Pete know that one of the silent participants found it fascinating and learned a lot. Also want to comment that this conversation is right up Ryan Woodard's alley. So I don't see him on the screen today, but we can rub that in next time.
Yeah. Ryan had a conflict, so that's why I'm standing in as host, but I'll have to direct him to the Facebook link because he just loves music so much. So
absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Janet, if you have anything to say, anyone else? Well, with that, then we're going to close out for this week, and we'll see you all here next week, same time, same station, and we'll look forward to it.
Sounds great. Thanks, Lawrence. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.